Hey everybody, I'm Joe, and around here we like to talk about monsters. Specifically, we talk about monsters for Dungeons & Dragons with an emphasis on 5th edition. We talk about running them at the table, we talk about homebrewing them, and we talk about building campaigns and story arcs around them. And today I want to take a look at running a monster directly out of the monster manual. Let's get started. So today I want to talk about running a simple, small monster and how we can build a story arc or a mini story arc around it. Something that is important to think about as you take a look at monsters. And I want to start at a very humble beginning. I want to start with the lowly, sometimes loved, sometimes despised, 1/4 challenge rating monster, the zombie, found on page 316 of your monster manual. The zombie is something that's been, of course, a much loved and much used monster throughout D&D, and we're going to examine that it actually draws its roots from very interesting places in lore and in culture, and it gives us some ideas on exactly where and how we might use it in our campaigns. So the zombie actually owes its heritage. The heritage, both generally speaking and specifically in Dungeons and Dragons, back to Haitian and Haitian Creole culture from the early 1800s, specifically as a reaction to New World slavery. The first iteration of the zombie, as we might be able to see it or recognize it, is actually from a short story from 1838 called The Unknown Painter. And in this first iteration, the zombie still has the background of one thing that's very important to its history, which is a necromancer or a spellcaster that brings the zombie back for a specific purpose, to do a specific job. Okay? This is the background of zombie stories for the next 100 years. In 1932, Bela Lugosi was in a movie called The White Zombie, and even here, 100 years later, we still have a necromancer or a spellcaster that is bringing the undead up for their own purpose. And in pop novels, in pulp fiction, during this period of time, early 1900s, all the way through the 1950s, this is the way zombies are presented, and this is exactly the way that they are presented in Dungeons & Dragons in the Monster Manual. And it's actually not until 1968, with George Romero's Night of the Living Dead, that we have a total reversal of the way that zombies are presented in their lore in movies and in TV shows eventually, and in other forms of literature. Specifically, with Night of the Living Dead, the zombies have no master. They are not responding to any one particular spellcaster. They are without purpose. And this allowed Romero to do some really interesting social critiques during his movies. That's the topic of another video, and if you haven't seen the original 1968 Night of the Living Dead, you are missing out on a classic. But that's besides the point of this particular video. So with the Monster Manual for Dungeons & Dragons, you'll find the zombie. And the very first thing that is listed and described when talking about the zombie is a paragraph that is called Dark Servants. Specifically, this says that sinister necromantic magic infuses the remains of the dead, causing them to rise as zombies that do their creator's bidding. So directly from the beginning, we have a heritage to the original zombie stories in pulp fiction from before 1968. Later in that paragraph, it even says, a zombie left without orders simply stands in place and rots unless something comes along that it can kill. So this implies a very specific type of monster, and it ties in with player character abilities, specifically the Necromancy Wizard or the Oathbreaker Paladin, which take control of and direct undead as part of their subclass features. So how do we run the zombie as a storytelling mechanism in our campaigns. We'll get to running them in combat in just a minute, but let's start with the campaigns and the story. The idea of a zombie being raised by somebody for a specific reason implies a larger world. It implies a larger story. What if we run into a zombie that has not been given orders? We know it would be standing in place doing nothing, but that implies that it's been abandoned. What happened to the necromancer? Or perhaps zombies have been raised and they are doing some task. They are not specifically going and attacking civilization. They are doing something and are only dangerous when they are approached. What are they doing? Who are they doing it for? Do we know who the necromancer is, who's raised these zombies from the grave? Do we know what they want? And of course, how are our players going to get past the certainly numerous undead that are guarding the tower where the necromancer lives? Or, and I think this might even be more interesting, do we even know who the wizard is who is raising the undead from the grave? And if we don't, we have a mystery to solve. Perhaps it's even one of the PCs that our players have met. Zombies are a 1/4 challenge rating monster, meaning that we run them against very low level parties, levels 1 and 2 predominantly. The zombie is in fact the very first monster I ever ran against my players, and it's a totally appropriate monster for very entry level games. It's a good monster to introduce new players to. It's a low enough monster that you could actually have multiple zombies in an initial encounter, which is interesting. And you can also open up a campaign with the characters in different locations, and they could each run into an individual zombie and then come together as part of that narrative. The zombie actually has a lot of potential for storytelling if we look at that lore and where the zombie comes from. So, how do we run it in combat? So the zombie is something that is not particularly loved by a lot of DMs. And one of the predominant reasons for that is that the zombie is quite boring in its mechanics for combat. It has a 20 feet move speed, which means it is slower than your PCs. That's actually very intentional, right? Zombies are supposed to shuffle and move more slowly, and that's part of a lot of the horror in great zombie scenes throughout fiction. The zombie has a single slam attack, which does an average of 4 damage. It's a 1d6 plus 1 damage roll with a +3 to hit modifier. Nothing particularly interesting. The zombie doesn't have any significant ability to create its own undead, like in movies that we know and love, but it does have one particularly interesting ability. All zombies, and there are 3 in the monster manual, have something called Undead Fortitude. When you drop a zombie to 0 hit points, it gets to do a Constitution saving throw. The DC is 5 plus the damage that was just delivered, and if it succeeds, it gets to stand back up with 1 hit point. And it can do this indefinitely, essentially. The only exceptions are if it's a critical hit or radiant damage. This is something that is very flavorful. It's thematic that the zombie, no matter how hard you hit it, has the potential to get back up. So we can run the zombie as groups, we can run the zombie as individuals, and we can tailor them to very entry-level and low-level parties and very entry-level players. Players who have not played the game before will understand the mechanics of fighting a zombie. I actually think it's a fantastic monster to introduce at the beginning of a campaign. It doesn't scale particularly well, and once clerics have the ability to destroy undead with their channel divinity, you can basically guarantee that a whole wrath of zombies will be annihilated, which that might be fun to throw at your players anyway. So the next thing I want to take a look at is how might we scale the zombie upwards. So normally what I like to do when I'm taking a look at a monster and thinking about scaling it is taking a look at how I might add abilities to its ability contours, as well as perhaps hit points or armor class or things like that, in order to create variations that are appropriate at different challenge ratings. But with the zombie, that's not necessarily what you want to do. With the zombie, it actually, I think, makes more sense to think about the different things you might want to zombify. The zombie is really just a modification of the commoner stat block in the monster manual. The commoner has a ability contour of 10s across the board, where the zombie has an increase in strength and constitution, and it loses abilities in every other part of the stat block. The other two zombies that are in the monster manual are the zombie beholder and the zombie ogre, and they present very interesting juxtapositions on how to create a zombie. With the zombie beholder, we obviously have a zombie that is a modification of the well-loved beholder, which you can find on page 28 of your monster manual. The beholder is a CR 13 monster, and as the beholder becomes a zombie beholder, its armor class drops from 18 to 15, its hit points drop, its strength remains unchanged, its dexterity drops from 14 to 8, its constitution drops from 18 to 16, its intelligence drops from 17 to 3, its wisdom drops from 15 to 8, which indicates less awareness of its surroundings, and its charisma drops from 17 to 5. We're going to notice that zombies universally have abysmal intelligence and charisma scores, which makes a lot of sense when you think about it. So the zombie beholder is a challenge rating 5 monster, which is a precipitous drop from the state it was in when it was alive. That means that you can take a well-loved monster that is relatively high challenge rating, you can alter its stat block and its ability significantly and make a much lower zombie version of it, which might be fun at lower levels. The ogre is a really interesting alternative way of creating a zombie. The ogre is a challenge rating 2 monster, and the ogre zombie is a challenge rating 2 monster. It doesn't decrease. In fact, there's some interesting changes to the ability contours. The hit points as the ogre goes from its alive state to its undead state actually increase from 59 to 85, but its armor class decreases from 11 to 8. Those two things balance out. Being able to hit the ogre just about every time means you're going to burn through those hit points a lot faster. The strength remains unchanged, just as it did with the zombie beholder. The dexterity drops from 8 to 6. The constitution actually goes up from 16 to 18. Intelligence drops from 5 to 3, wisdom drops from 7 to 6, and charisma drops from 7 to 5. So all of the mental stats for all of these zombies are really bad. There's also very low dexterity, which makes sense for a zombie monster. So how might we create zombie creatures? How might we take a stat block and alter it to make it a zombie? Well, it seems that we need the zombie to attack using strength. It is not going to be dexterous, and it just can't use a dexterity-based attack because it's going to have low speed, it's going to have low initiative, and using dexterity as its attack doesn't make a lot of sense. So we want to take a monster that uses strength as its attacking statistic. We can alter the constitution up or down, but we want to make it actually relatively reasonable. This is to indicate that you can take a zombie, you can stab it through the heart, you can chop off an arm, and it will still come after you. So a relatively high constitution makes sense. It also, of course, makes sense that we're going to take all mental stats and we're going to dump them. Every mental stat for every zombie creature is a negative modifier. And that's something we really need to stick with. So as we create a zombie, we really have the ability to do lots of things with the stat block, but lowering the armor class, keeping the strength, and dumping the mental statistics are all things that make sense. So with that, I'd like to create a zombie with you right now. What I'm going to create here is a zombie based off of another normal creature in the monster manual, and I think I'm actually going to keep its challenge rating the same. I'm just going to look at what might be fun to play with and how might I alter the stat block of a monster. And I decided that I needed a flying zombie. Technically, the beholder zombie has a fly speed and no walking speed, but we really don't expect them to fly through the air. I wanted an undead thing that flew through the skies to terrify my players. So I decided to create an undead griffin. The griffin, of course, is a very fun challenge rating 2 monster that you can find in the monster manual. It has a walking speed of 30, but a flying speed of 80. It has an armor class of 12, about 59 hit points, and it is a strength-based attack creature with a multi-attack. The Griffin Zombie, I want to keep at the same challenge rating. So I'm going to increase its Constitution from a +3 to a +4 modifier. That's a 16 to an 18. I'm going to leave the strength the same. That one change increases the hit points for my Griffin Zombie. So I'm actually going to have an average of 66 hit points as opposed to 59 just by modifying that Constitution modifier. Okay? Dexterity is going to drop precipitously from a 15 to an 8. I'm going to drop its intelligence from a 2 to a 1. I could have left it the same, but I didn't feel an undead version of a monster would have the same intelligence as the living version, so I had to drop it. Wisdom drops from a 13 to a 7, and Charisma is going to drop from an 8 to a 5. That stays in line with the way that we've seen the other zombies. I have to give it undead fortitude. And so it's going to have that same ability that's in all of the other zombies, which allows it to get back up after dropping to 0 hit points if it succeeds a Constitution saving throw, which is another reason why the Constitution just can't be a negative number for zombies. However, the Griffin has an ability called Keen Sight, which gives it advantage on sight-based perception checks. I felt that just didn't work for a zombie creature. It has much less situational awareness, so I removed that feature. However, one feature I wanted to leave, and it's not in the stat block of the Griffin, it's part of the flavor text, and it says that the Griffin, being a large creature, can serve as a mount for anything medium size or smaller. There's no reason a flying zombie Griffin would not be able to do the same thing. So I could introduce my zombie Griffin flying and attacking the party as an undead thing of the skies, and later I could have some sort of an evil NPC or a monster ride undead griffins through the air into battle. And I think that that image is so flavorful and so much fun. So anyway, that is my take on creating a zombie based off of a stat block in the monster manual. As always, thanks for being with me. Thanks for hanging out and talking monsters with me. YouTube is literally made out of buttons, so press things that are around here, and I hope to see you next time. All right, bye.